There we go. Thank you, Dan. Don't leave. I'd like to ask Dan and Vincent and Stephen to come up here. Excuse me, and we can entertain some questions. It is on. Great. So I have a mic here. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll pass you the mic.
This one's for Stephen. I had a question on the backer rod. When you made it into a ring form, one of the images showed a white section. Were you just using Tyvek where the join came together to mitigate abrasion?
Yeah, that was the idea. And often we'll, when we connected these, whether it was, you can also connect those, that's cool. You can also connect the backer rod with skewers also. A little awkward, you can. And that's where we started was using the skewers, and then the Tyvek would just coat that seam so that it wouldn't stand on baskets.
Okay, that's right.
So that's essentially the idea, but we found it just as easy to hot glue them together and then, wrap it with Tyvek, which is hot glued in any case.
Okay. While I have the microphone, one for Dan. I understand the need to use a Sharpie to register top and get the sense of where you're at with the form. How did you get rid of the Sharpie in the process? I mean,
oh, on the action, on the mount.
on the acrylic.
On the acrylic. Just used a little acrylic polish. It has the polish that has not the clear spray, but the little bracelet to it. Acetone went pretty well. Acetone.
Alcohol also works if you just dust the material. Dan, I have more comments. I've worked with acrylic for a long time. If I make a pattern like you have, I usually will do it out of a piece of wood, and then I can tape together a number of pieces of acrylic and route. So, because I always prepare for something going wrong. So the first one I might break or something, then I have an instant duplicate that I don't have to go to a lot of trouble to make another one out. And then you get the nice smooth edges from the routers.
Right, and that's the thing, if you can mechanize to do it, you'll save yourself definitely some process time.
And then I tend to use non-glare a lot.
I've used that by accident, and it does work pretty well.
Because we recycle a lot of acrylic. A lot of acrylic gets thrown away, and I'll save it for vitrines, and because I can use the side of a vitrine for a book cradle or almost anything.
And that's the thing with there's still a lot of experimentation that can be done to make that system have the right look for the piece you're putting on. So non-glare does work well, especially for something with a lot of open work.
And we do have an oven, so it does really help.
I'd like to hear more about your oven at some point. You should publish the design. Questions? Any more questions up here?
I wanted to ask Vincent, are you the terracotta? Yes. Yeah. About the choice of using half-inch plate, if that was any specific calculation that came up with that dimension of metal, and then also about how long you had from the time you visited and did your templates to the time that they actually showed up at your facility, the objects.
So I used half-inch plate because that was the thickest plate I could cut with a plasma cutter. And then, but it really is pretty, if it's pretty wide and with the two legs, it's very, very good going in that direction. And also the warrior is more stable from this way to that way also. And we had about 2 months, but it was also during the Christmas holiday. So most of that work got done in about a month. So it was like, yeah, we were really under the gun. And again, thank you to my colleague Gina, who really, did a lot of the backbreaking work. And we were both pretty sore and injured by the time it was all done. Oh, I wanted to also mention that in my post presentation tomorrow, I'm going to have, if my luggage gets here, I'll have some handouts and stuff on some of those calculations that I was doing in case people fell asleep, which I'm sure people did.
So, Stephen, on the use of the skewers and the Velara and the backer rod, it looked like you had a lot of kind of dynamic, small adjustment in that for applying, a little bit more support force or a little bit clamping pressure. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, I did. And but you're talking about the Velara clamps in specific.
Well, kind of. It seemed like all the different components that you were making in, and I'm specifically thinking of the ones where the skewer would be stuck in and things would be kind of elevated.
Yeah.
But it seemed like there would probably be enough internal friction in forcing a skewer through something like that that you could give a little push and it would stay and provide little bits of upward or downward pressure if you need it.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of this goes back to feel and then having enough materials around with enough dimension. So, sometimes if the thinner Velara would be fine, or you might want to bump it up, just, for that, just so that it would have enough tension to support. Having those long skewers come up and support things was often really awkward. I mean, the whole idea was to be able to remove things easily, so that if a conservator wanted to work with the basket, they could. The reality is some of these were very Rube Goldberg. They did their job, but man, putting them back together is like a whole other thing. The advantages to skewers, it's so flexible, and yet it can get a little out of hand, which we had the experience of. I think that the objects themselves, as they are on their trays, they're perfectly well supported. But again, it comes back to having a lot of different options. If a piece of Velara is not going to work, maybe a piece of backer rod will. If I cut that and maybe even hot glue Velara onto the cut surface, so that becomes the support.
Yeah, well, another good tool in the quiver. And I had the good fortune of seeing the Chinese warriors, and Vince, those were amazing mounts. It was really cool to watch.
Thank you.
I have a question for Vincent. Are you going to elaborate on the improvements that you were thinking about?
Sure. Like I said, when I first saw the Warriors, I was an apprentice at LA County, and they just had some webbing across the bottom of them. And so then when they came to our institution, the Chinese preparators brought little brackets at their feet, and I tried to make some posts that would come up ahead of time that could go over and grab them. I didn't like that idea because the post is a kind of a pendulum, and so is the piece, and they would be in opposition to each other. I shake table tested some mounts, and that seemed to be the problem with mounts that weren't like form fitted or secured. That one thing would try to escape from the other. So I wanted to you know, the idea of doing a form-fitting seismic map was really exciting to me.
Another question for Vincent. We all do a little welding here and there, but I was pretty impressed by the heavy-duty nature of your project. Was just curious if you had done that kind of heavy stock work before, if it came easy to you, if you had to really push your skills a little bit to get there. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the welding equipment that you used, what was necessary. And then also, I don't know if you addressed it or if I just missed it, what kind of finish was put on these? Were they painted or something before they were padded?
I'm not sure. They were just primed and painted, and I just used an acrylic paint, and we just kind of didn't try to really model throw it out. We have different schools of thought in my museum. I like to throw things out, but some of the curators feel like it's kind of cheating, so they just want kind of just a general tone. We moved the Asian from the park to the Civic Center, and so at that point, they supplied me with the shop that you saw there. Before, I only had a settling B tank and a grinder and drill press and some hand tools, which I think a lot of us have. And I did some steel work back then, but I had to like literally. I used a hacksaw and a drill press to get some of the shapes out. So I had some experience with a little bit of experience with the Falcon cutter, starting around 2000. And so at that point we redid the collection. So I had, I kind of learned as I was going along then, and so I had some experience by the time we got to the waters. So that was it. Went to the other question before. Yes, so I was able to bring, the tools that I developed to the point where now I can really feel like I can really do a much better job than I had before.
Is there a chance that you could make your PowerPoint presentations available to us somehow, Dropbox link or something like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there should be a larger discussion, or maybe people have already figured out like how I'd like to see all of our PowerPoints out there, and I'd be happy to try to make it available. And like I said, I'm going to have some handouts tomorrow, and I think some of our other poster presenters are trying to. I think the whole idea of these forums is to try to disseminate this information and make it accessible. And I love developing it, and I don't believe this information should be proprietary. It's my idea that it gets, if there's some way that it could get make it accessible to everybody.
I definitely agree with that. I think there's a kind of feature of these presentations where it's a bit of a dog and pony show. Like, look what we did. This is great. But I think that idea of like, okay, so this should be everybody's skill set. It's a big goal.
Yeah, and I think that there should be a point where there's so much information out there, and at the same time, it would be nice to have discussions. I don't know how to really how it would go, but to develop consensus on methodologies and ways that we can say, yeah, this is the best way to do this. Or it's difficult because I know I've been doing this for over 20 years, and there's always something new that comes up. There's always a new problem. So the idea of doing like a methodology for something that's always new, but maybe other people have done it before. It'd be nice to see like what to get all that information together and just try to see like, wow, that's really great, or maybe we can improve this, or that's what I'm hoping. That's why I'm excited about coming to these forums, is trying to find a way to do that and get that information out there.
Yeah, if I may, I think I'm really glad that you brought that up. It's a really good point. And I'm sure that, excuse me, that's was fundamental to why Mac and BJ and the Getty started this, not only as as a presentation form, but the online form particularly. And that is the next step in our planning for this particular event, is to have these all archived and posted for everybody to see and use whenever.
It's also being videotaped.
Yeah, it is being videotaped, and that'll be posted on YouTube eventually.
Just to follow up on Vince's comment, we do have a small website going right now on the AIC Wikipedia, which we can talk about a little bit later. But it's sort of an archive right now for past forums. It has all of the presentations, at least in a topic format, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to have, at the very least, links to various archive video presentations. But it's a start, and we're trying to get it together so that we have this available to everyone, wherever they're at.
I've got a question for all three of you, and that is, perhaps starting with Dan, and working across the table, what were the considerations, if any, for vertical restraint in what you were doing?
Most of the considerations, as it for holding the pieces on to the mounts, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, for restricting them
Yeah,
from vertical uplift.
Yeah, it has been the strategic use of the small hooks throughout the form. Some only required, a few, or so. Others would require a dozen if needed to hold the piece in place. And because of the form of the mount itself, it actually held the pieces, most pieces, very well, even without any hooks. But of course, you want something so it doesn't fall off, but or shift during the period of the exhibit. But yeah, it is a piece by piece kind of consideration of how many hooks and whatnot that you use. And I found that really sufficed without having to make any other kinds of clips or screw-on attachments to hold things in place, or even felt or anything for added friction.
Did you ever consider sewing it down instead of hooking it?
It's possible, and it is another, you could use that method. I'm not exactly sure why we went with the hook system. I think it was probably a time frame thing, and that it was a little bit quicker.
We have some down before occasionally.
One other thing, Jamie wrote an article, actually delivered a paper at the Smithsonian in 2010, describing receiver systems, similar to what you were showing. And I was wondering, you mentioned the integration of drilling out the threaded standoff.
Right.
And was there a set screw or something added to that would prevent vertical uplift on the post?
In most cases, no. I found that just the pressure fit alone, and also some of the residual threading that was left inside the sleeve when you drilled it out, that kind of tooth in there was really enough to grip the piece in place. But I mean, in other locations where you have other seismic concerns, you might want to add a little set screw on the inside there to make sure.
I think Jamie's design had that incorporation.
Well, yeah, and I think that because we worked a lot on, distant mounts for the first show, and I think we used some set screws in some of them, and we didn't use set screws in others as we found need be. But Santa Fe is a pretty seismically stable area, at least in the basic concept. Whether it is in the long term or not, knowing Vice Caldera is one of the largest calderas around, it's not
you know, I think it's, you know, totally a part of the system. It's usually one either.
And it was actually really surprising. I mean, with a lot of them, when you go to, it's not just, oh, placing it on those posts. Usually it's kind of a, you know, press bit, so it does hold it very well.
Yeah. Vincent, I know you talked about bolting down the plates for those contour mounts, but what was it, 13 line screws?
Yeah, 13 screws, and also, like I was saying, I try really hard to make a really tight form-fitting mount. So to pull onto that mount, it does a lot to keep any, keep the vertical, like at least very, very stiffly. Now, in terms of like stresses that are put on it, even in the base isolated building, I'm not really sure. I didn't take into those considerations in those calculations, like what. Usually, when I think of vertical, I know there's a lot of stress on the material itself. In my mind, I think more about it aiding in the overturning of the sculpture, because it might not be that much big of a vertical component, but when the two combine together, there could be one point would be slight vertical, and then if the lateral force comes in at the right time, that's what causes a lot of the overturning to really isn't taken into consideration very often. So I feel like if I can keep that, keep those forces down, I mean, do shape. The biggest thing that I said before was, and this was the disappointment, was just not being able to work longer on the horse mounts, and that, to me was the soft spot in that whole scenario. And yeah, the vertical, in the vertical in that, I just tried to come up as far as I could, or around the sides to try to compensate for any of that. So that's the best that I could do under those time constraints.
Stephen? Any thoughts for vertical restraint?
Yeah, where we found ourselves was balancing the structural integrity of the baskets and also the hats, which many of the baskets were structurally really sound. I mean, they had that matrix, which essentially didn't need to be supported unless there were breaks and splits. But then, what do I do with a hat that has a feather? My expectation is that it would need to have something. On the baskets, we would often deal with parts that were affixed, either fringe. Sometimes there would be sound makers, like little almost valves, or handles that were strings. Things that we feel like we need to take the weight off. And the Volare and skewer method was handy because it allowed a kind of soft way of doing that. Whereas, when we get that shape, I expect that a lot of that stuff is going to flex, and hopefully flex without then removing, itself from the scenario entirely. And again, sometimes time constraints with the hats. We got pretty elaborate, but the project leader was always coming by the registrar and saying, no, that ribbon really does not need support underneath it. Like, it has structural integrity as it is. Plus, we've got another 300 baskets to do, and we won't finish a few weeks left. So go. So it's this balance between what's the material that I'm dealing with. Will it be okay just sitting there on its own, or does it really need that support? And down to judgment calls sometimes.
I'm going to hang on to this mic for a little bit longer, I'm sorry. I think the afternoon session is a little lighter, so if we run over here, is that okay? Back to Vincent, you had referenced 0.3G potential acceleration force in your building if you had another seismic event similar to the '06.
Yeah, they go very large, or, very big earthquakes. Well, it's we our building is modeled after like the worst case scenario. So something, the 06 style is what we're kind of trying to model for. So the base isolators, when they kick in, and to be honest with you, it's the 0.3 Gs would be at the second floor, and there would only actually be a 0.2 G acceleration at the floor where the warriors were. But to be conservative, and also the calculations were there's if I got into more detail, the forces might have been reduced, but to try to just be conservative and to also not be so mind-numbing and keep it simple, the calculations came out a little bit heavy, a little bit conservative, but I wanted to do that so that we could just stay out of that out of that zone. But would be the response of the building for like forces of a G and a half from the ground.
Yeah, well, always wise to be conservative.
Yes, and if I can interrupt, does everybody in this room know what a base isolator is? Do you want to?
Sure. Our building's designed to dislocate from the earthquake forces, and so we've got some things that just slide, and also rubber elastomers that these rubber pads that are stacked up on each other under each footing, and when the earth moves, the building will just stay there, and the elastomer will move back and forth a little bit. And they're kind of simple, but there's several isolators that are in there that do some damping. In other words, like a shock absorber, they're just not completely loose, but they're slowing the building down a little bit. And also, they noticed that there was some torsion in the building, some twisting, and so the kinds of isolators and kinds of damping were designed to keep that torsion down and keep those forces down. And this technology is becoming is getting used more and more often, and we're actually looking into doing more things with this technology, and more engineers that I talk to are really believing in it, and I think it's kind of the way of the future, and hopefully.
And in your earthquake, you also have a lot of vertical movement, this kind of bounce shake. Did you take that into account as well?
I mean, we, as far as that, the best we can do is to try to dampen it, which the building does, and then just this all depends because we do have a fair amount of forces, like 0.3 Gs isn't nothing, even 0.2 Gs is something to worry about, and so we just our methodology that we're given by the engineers is to make things as stiff as possible, and just to and not to be eccentric, or not to try to make things that will dance with the earthquake or things like that. We try to keep them stiff so that they're going to respond the way that in a linear fashion, like this is how they're going to respond, and the building will do all the fancy stuff.
I was trying to get to the 0.3 G determination. I assume was derived at through a seismic study.
It was our engineer for Paul Wilder for Elsister. That's the model that he did. That's what he came up with as the maximum acceleration of the building.
Mm-hmm. And it was factored into seemingly most of your equations for the moment of overturning.
Well, I just use that as like the benchmark, so the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking, I'm sure the audience as a whole is fascinated by the opportunity to calculate the type of force it takes to overturn an object, but it seems unlikely most people are going to be able to have a seismic study, to get that key number to factor in. And do you know of any way that these calculations can be used by people who don't have a seismic study done?
Well, tomorrow they might hand out. I'm going to hand out an appendix that's going to frighteningly show what the expected ground oceans are in different areas of the United States. And so, and since most people aren't in base isolated structure, if they want to model for the heaviest potential earthquake in their area, there's a spectrum of what they can expect. And if you're not in a base isolated building, then the spectrum is going to look pretty frightening to you. And so you can plug that in. You can plug in 0.7 or whatever whatever it might be in your area, and the calculation will work and scare you even more.
Excellent. Just following up with you, I think the last question I have for you is, or maybe two more, sorry. You mentioned that you didn't have access underneath the display surface for these warriors, thus you used the lags.
Yeah.
And naturally, there's no doubt in the world that you live in one of the most seismically active areas. Why did you not have access underneath your display surface?
It's just the bureaucracy of being in an institution and trying to fight with the designer and the curator and what's the best way to do things.
I sympathize. BJ and I come up against this all the time, and I don't bring it up to accuse you of anything. I just bring it up because it is a major issue, and I think it's important to keep pushing for it, even when you can't get it.
Yeah.
And then the last question for you: did the mounts go back with the objects? Were the Chinese?
Unfortunately, that's another bureaucratic thing. In China, the bureaucracy is even more horrendous. And so they wanted, the people that were there wanted them, but then getting their bosses to do the paperwork to get them over there and pay for it and stuff. It didn't materialize, and part of it because the people who follow them around rotate, and so there's this. It's the bureaucracy, and the Chinese method is to everyone gets a turn. All the people can be employed, and so it's literally Kafkaesque. It's not a joke.
So the answer is no.
The answer is no. Yeah, short answer no.
I'm sorry to hear it. Beautiful mount.
Yeah, thank you.
Stephen, just a last question here for you. Are you able to use components, or what's the thought process about taking the storage mount and using it in any capacity for display?
Those mounts are really not for display at all. So it's really transportation at that point. We have an off-site storage facility. And so they allow it or help us to bring objects to where they're going to actually be displayed. But I do note that it changed some of our mount making concepts. This idea of having a soft mount. If something just simply needs a simple angled support, why go with brass or a pin that'll go through a deck? If I can use really high density e-foam, that then I can use less go on and then put the deck fabric right on that, so I have a little soft wedge. So I think that the project did influence some of our mount making, but in general it's very much for a long-term climate controlled storage that where the looks of the piece doesn't really matter. I mean, there was that fantastic slide where you can't really even see the basket very well. Conservation says this is what we want. The curators, if they want to see that basket, they're probably going to have to look at our photograph. They can certainly see it in the mount. So does that answer your question?
Well, how would a display mount differ? What would you do for a display mount? How many of those hats, say?
Okay. Well, the hats, the simple domed hats, that was an easy one. because we just made an acrylic rod, vertical, with an e-foam form inside that was then covered with Velar, and it's just placed there. So it's in effect, it's a very similar structure, but that feathered basket is now on display. It was part of that curation by the later council, and we made a mount for it so it would hang. These feathered baskets were hanging baskets, and the tassels just hang as you would see them if you owned it. So the tassels are resting against the feathers, what conservation didn't want. So then it becomes a question of conservation calling the shot. How long will they allow these tassels to be resting against the feathers? Whereas the Native Americans involved in the council are saying, what is the big deal? This is how it's supposed to be seen. Don't get fussy.
Any more questions?
I just hate to move off the technical, but we have to often sustain a budget on a project we only have 30% drawings on, and then there's change orders. And how do you guys deal with that kind of thing, or are those issues for you at all?
No. We never have 30% off.
A lot of those cases, we say if we can get it done, we will. It's sometimes it influences the mount making and how the simplicity of the mount might not get as floating and as dynamic of a display. The consequences are usually very few. You still find a way to.
You're just going broadly 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, applying some sort of.
To figure out how long.
Yeah, how long.
I don't know if I could really even answer that.
Well,
we're told we have this many mounts to make.
Well, as former lead of this crew for a while.
He knows the formula.
Yeah. Well, no, there wasn't one. No, there was no formula. Here's the number of objects, here's the opening day.
Can you get it done?
Yeah, and we didn't actually even have control of the budget. We were told how much the budget was. So, it was fitting what we could do into a set of parameters that were absolutely arbitrary, and often with more objects yet to come or yet to go out of the show, and drawings that still weren't done. Yeah, I mean, it's just, it was the ultimate inflexibility and just figure it out. And sometimes it did pretty well, and sometimes it wasn't.
It sounds so familiar.
Yeah. Excuse me. I'm sure a lot of these aspects of this problem are common to all of us. And my stock response is usually, well, it's going to take as long as it takes. And I know that's glib, but as Dan said, the fact is it's rare when we don't get done what they want to get done. And that's partly because the royalty here in this room as Mountmakers and exhibit people are usually at the tail end of the whole exhibit planning process. So therefore, any delays on the lead end, we are the ones who usually have to pay those consequences, bear those consequences rather. So there is no, I don't think there is no easy answer or easy solution rather for this problem, other than always stress for the need for as much advanced planning as possible for any project. You know, people say, oh, why do you need to plan 2 years out, 3 years out? You know, or more, of course, for some, and these are the reasons.
I mean, in the case of the Warriors, the logistics were nightmares. I mean, we were designing as we were going along. There were some. It was a huge struggle to get it all up on time. And I basically, the only thing that I did from my end was I told my boss that if you want these need to get done, because usually I'm just not doing. I've got multiple projects going on at the same time. That was such a giant project. It's like, you know, it's going to take this much work and this much time to do this, and this is going to get done on time. You have to clear my. I have to be clear for a month, or you're not talking to me. I'm just doing it, and I'm just doing this. You're not interrupting me, and that's it. And that's the only thing that saved me was like being able to serve myself, which I know is. A lot of us don't have that choice. I don't always have that choice. I just have to fight. I just have to fight for it. That's usually what it comes down to.
Okay, Mark.
It's not really a question, but since we're having this discussion, as Paul mentioned, a colleague of ours used to say that we're always the last to get, we're the last link in the chain. And so it comes down to the people making mounts and being in the exhibition field. So there's that aspect of it. We have very little time at the end, and that can be compounded if it's something that requires a courier, or if it's a large show where you've got to have multiple things ready in advance. I hope that this forum helps spread the message, because it goes back through the conservation community. And perhaps, like you're saying, Vincent, they'll respect you when you say, you've got to clear my schedule. Because if they're not aware of that, it's going to keep going the way it has been. So I'm optimistic on that note.
One more question? Anybody else? Great.
So I'm at the Seattle Art Museum, and we're unique where we have 2 Mountmakers, and we're part of the exhibition design department. So we're not under conservation. So the benefit is that as soon as our exhibition designers, who's my direct boss, as soon as he talks to the curator, he comes straight to me. And sometimes I'm even part of the initial layout discussion, which is really helpful, because then I go to conservation and I say, are you sure do you know what's going on down here? Make sure they know too. So I guess that's a little unique to have that forward knowledge, but it's really helpful.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a little closer to how we work as well. So I don't think it's that unique. I think I've seen, maybe evenly balanced both kinds of hierarchies, at least in this country. Anybody else? Okay, let's have lunch and be back here, let's say 2:15.